Some nights, the sound of your own heartbeat becomes the loudest thing in a house gone silent with fear. Margaret Hale knew that sound well, the rhythm of terror that echoed through her home every time Sheriff Amos Briggs walked through the door. In 1884 Montana Territory, she was just a schoolteacher, trapped in a marriage to a man whose badge made him untouchable. When Amos struck her down on Main Street one winter night, a giant ranch hand named Elias Boone stepped in to help. With one punch, Elias sent the sheriff into the snow and offered Margaret protection. She didn't know that her savior was hiding a deadly past as a hired killer. As they fled into the wilderness, Amos gathered a posse to hunt them down. But when the truth about Elias finally comes out, will Margaret realize she's escaped one killer only to trust another? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolhouse floor as Margaret Hale arranged the day's lessons on her worn teaching slate. 23 years she had stood before this same chalkboard, watching children grow from fidgeting 6-year-olds into young adults ready to face the harsh realities of frontier life. The slate bore the scratches and stains of countless arithmetic problems, spelling words, and geography lessons about places most of these children would never see. Yet for Margaret, this simple piece of worn stone represented something precious, a sanctuary where knowledge mattered more than fear, where her voice carried authority instead of trembling with dread. Outside, the October wind whistled through the gaps in the schoolhouse walls, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the distant sounds of Sunrise Creek, preparing for another day. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not entirely from the cold. Even here, in this place she had created as her refuge, the shadow of Sheriff Amos Briggs seemed to reach its dark fingers into every corner of her life. She had arrived in Sunrise Creek in 1861, fresh from a teaching college in Denver, full of dreams about bringing education to the frontier. At 27, Margaret possessed the kind of quiet beauty that drew respectful glances from the ranchers and miners who made up the town's population. Her auburn hair, always pinned back in a practical bun, caught the light like burnished copper, and her green eyes held a warmth that promised understanding to anyone seeking comfort. The town council had been delighted to secure such a qualified teacher, especially one willing to work for the modest salary they could afford. Amos Briggs had been among the first to welcome her, then 35 and recently appointed sheriff. He cut an impressive figure in his pressed uniform and polished badge. He possessed the kind of confidence that frontier communities valued in their lawmen, a steady voice, a firm handshake, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he began courting her with Sunday dinners and evening walks along the creek, Margaret felt fortunate to have caught the attention of such a respected man. The wedding in the spring of 1862 had been the social event of the season. Margaret wore her mother's dress, carefully altered and pressed, while Amos stood proud in his best uniform. The entire town celebrated their union, and Margaret believed she had found not just love, but security in a land where both were precious commodities. The first signs of trouble came gradually, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Amos's protective nature, which had initially seemed charming, slowly revealed itself as possessive control. He questioned her conversations with parents about their children's progress, grew irritated when she stayed late to help struggling students, and began making subtle comments about her proper place as a sheriff's wife. The physical violence started in their 3rd year of marriage, triggered by what Amos called her defiant attitude toward his authority. A slap across the face for speaking too freely at a town meeting, a bruising grip on her arm for laughing too loudly at a church social. Each incident was followed by tearful apologies and promises that it would never happen again, promises that lasted only until the next time Margaret unknowingly crossed whatever invisible line Amos had drawn around her existence. By their 5th anniversary, Margaret had learned to read the signs like a frontier guide, reading weather patterns. The way Amos's jaw tightened when he felt his authority questioned. The particular tone his voice took when he had been drinking with his deputies. The measured pace of his footsteps on the front porch that meant she had somehow disappointed him again. She developed strategies for survival, speaking softly, agreeing quickly, making herself small and unnoticeable when his temper threatened to surface. The townspeople, if they suspected anything, chose to look the other way. Sheriff Briggs maintained order in a lawless territory, keeping the peace between rival ranchers and mining interests that could have easily erupted into violence. His harsh methods with criminals and troublemakers earned him respect, and most folks reasoned that a man who kept their streets safe deserved their loyalty. If Margaret occasionally appeared with bruises that she attributed to clumsiness, or if she seemed unusually quiet at social gatherings, well, marriage was a private matter between husband and wife. Margaret's only escape was her teaching. Within the schoolhouse walls, she could be the person she had been before marriage, before fear became her constant companion. She poured herself into her lessons, staying late to help children who struggled with their letters, organizing Christmas pageants that brought the whole community together, and writing detailed reports to the Territorial Education Office that sometimes resulted in precious funding for new books and supplies. It was during one of these late afternoons that she first noticed Elias Boone. Through the schoolhouse window, she watched as the giant of a man helped unload supplies at Henderson's general store. Even from a distance, his size was remarkable, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would break ordinary men. His movements were careful and deliberate, suggesting strength held in careful check. Unlike most of the drifters who passed through Sunrise Creek, Elias stayed. Old Tom Henderson hired him to help with the heavier work around the store, and soon word spread that the big man was reliable, honest, and surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating appearance. Children who might have been frightened by his size instead found themselves drawn to his quiet kindness. Margaret watched from her window as he patiently helped little Sarah Morrison reach a high shelf for her mother, his massive hands steady and gentle as he lifted the child. Margaret learned his story in pieces, gathered from overheard conversations and casual observations. Elias had drifted into town 3 months ago, carrying only a worn bedroll and the clothes on his back. He spoke little about his past, saying only that he had worked cattle ranches across Montana and Wyoming. Tom Henderson, desperate for help with the physical demands of running a frontier general store, had been grateful for Elias's arrival and didn't press for details about his background. What struck Margaret most about the mysterious ranch hand was his gentleness. She observed him helping elderly Mrs. Patterson with her heavy market basket, his voice low and respectful as he inquired about her health. She watched him patiently redirect rowdy cowboys who might have caused trouble, using his imposing presence to calm situations without resorting to violence. There was something almost courtly in his manner, as if he had been raised with different values than the rough frontier codes that governed most men in their territory. Amos, naturally, viewed the newcomer with suspicion. Any man who commanded respect without wearing a badge was a potential threat to the sheriff's authority. He made pointed inquiries about Elias's background, questioned his right to remain in town without steady employment, and generally made it clear that the giant was being watched. When these intimidation tactics failed to drive Elias away, Amos's hostility grew more obvious. Margaret found herself looking forward to glimpses of Elias through her classroom window. There was something calming about his presence, a sense of quiet strength that reminded her of the oak trees back in Denver, deeply rooted, unshakable, offering shelter to anyone who needed it. She began timing her walk home to coincide with his work schedule, treasuring the polite nods and occasional "Good evening, Mrs. Briggs" that he offered as she passed. These small interactions became dangerous when Amos noticed them. The sheriff's jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, erupted into accusations and demands for explanations. Why was she walking past Henderson's store when her direct route home lay in the opposite direction? What business did she have exchanging pleasantries with a drifter who had no proper place in their community? Margaret learned to vary her routes, to keep her eyes down when passing the store, to make herself invisible in ways that broke her heart a little more each day. The autumn of 1884 brought unusual tensions to Sunrise Creek. A dispute between cattle ranchers and miners over water rights had escalated into threats and occasional violence. Amos's response was characteristically harsh: public beatings for anyone caught fighting, hefty fines for disturbing the peace, and a general atmosphere of intimidation that kept order through fear rather than respect. Margaret watched her husband's methods with growing unease, recognizing the same bullying tactics he used at home now being applied to the entire community. It was during this period of heightened tension that Margaret made her fatal mistake. Young Timothy Fletcher, one of her brightest students, had been caught stealing apples from Henderson's store. The boy's father had been injured in a mining accident, leaving the family struggling to put food on the table. When Amos dragged the frightened 12-year-old to the schoolhouse, demanding that Margaret witness the proper punishment for thieves, she found herself unable to remain silent. "Sheriff Briggs," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "surely we can find a better solution than violence against a hungry child." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Amos's face darkened with a fury that Margaret recognized all too well. But this time, they were not alone in their home, where his anger could be hidden behind closed doors. Timothy Fletcher cowered between them, tears streaming down his dirty face, while a small crowd of townspeople gathered outside the schoolhouse to witness whatever drama was unfolding. "Mrs. Briggs," Amos said, his voice deadly quiet, "I believe you've forgotten your proper place in this community." Margaret felt the familiar fear rising in her chest, the instinctive need to apologize and submit that had become her survival mechanism. But something about Timothy's frightened face, about the watching crowd, about the teaching slate behind her that represented everything she had tried to preserve of her better self, made her stand straighter instead of shrinking away. "My place," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the autumn air, "is protecting the children in my care from unnecessary cruelty." The slap came so quickly that Margaret barely saw Amos's hand move. The sound echoed across the schoolyard like a gunshot, and she staggered backward, her hand flying to her burning cheek. For a moment, the only sounds were Timothy's frightened sobs and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, measured, approaching with the inevitability of thunder following lightning. Margaret looked up through eyes, watering from pain and humiliation, to see Elias Boone walking toward them across the schoolyard. His face was calm, but something in his bearing made the crowd step aside without thinking, creating a clear path between him and the sheriff. "Sheriff Briggs," Elias said, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard, "I believe you owe Mrs. Briggs an apology." The world seemed to hold its breath. In 23 years of marriage, no one had ever challenged Amos's treatment of his wife. No one had ever dared to suggest that Sheriff Briggs might be in the wrong. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, not fear this time, but hope so sudden and unexpected that it made her dizzy. Amos's hand moved toward his gun, but Elias simply stood there, patient as stone, waiting for what would come next. And Margaret realized that whatever happened in the next few moments would change everything forever. The tension stretched between the two men like a taut wire ready to snap. Amos's hand hovered near his holstered Colt, his badge catching the afternoon light as his chest rose and fell with barely controlled rage. Around them, the gathered townspeople seemed frozen in place, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Elias stood with his hands at his sides, completely relaxed, yet somehow radiating a dangerous calm. Margaret noticed details she had never seen before, the way his worn leather gloves fit his massive hands like a second skin, the careful positioning of his feet that suggested a man ready for violence despite his peaceful stance. There was something almost military in his bearing, a precision that spoke of training far beyond what any ranch hand would need. "I don't believe I heard you correctly," Amos said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years, wearing a badge in lawless territory. "Did you just tell me how to handle my own wife?" "I told you to apologize to a lady who deserves better treatment," Elias replied, his tone respectful but unwavering. "Seems like the right thing to do." Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the confrontation unfold. Part of her wanted to speak, to diffuse the situation before it escalated beyond control. But another part, a part that had been buried under years of fear, desperately wanted to see what would happen if someone finally stood up to her husband. Young Timothy Fletcher had stopped crying, his wide eyes darting between the two men like a spectator at a prize fight. Mrs. Patterson clutched her market basket with white knuckles, while Tom Henderson had emerged from his store to witness the drama. Even the horses, hitched to the nearby posts, seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly and snorting in the crisp autumn air. "Mister," Amos said, taking a step closer to Elias, "you've been in my town for 3 months, and I've been patient with your presence. But interference with law enforcement is a serious crime in Montana territory." "Beating a woman in public doesn't seem much like law enforcement to me," Elias observed quietly. The words hit Amos like physical blows. His face flushed red above his carefully groomed beard, and Margaret saw the particular tightening around his eyes that always preceded his worst rages. She had learned to recognize that look, to brace herself for what was coming, but this time the storm would not fall on her alone. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace," Amos announced, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Elias didn't move. "And if I don't? Then I'll be forced to subdue a dangerous criminal who was threatening a peace officer." Margaret watched in fascination as something shifted in Elias's expression. The gentle ranch hand who helped elderly ladies with their packages disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more focused. It was like watching a mask fall away to reveal the true face beneath. "Sheriff Briggs," Elias said, his voice carrying a new edge, "I suggest you reconsider your course of action." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice, from someone who's seen how badly these situations can end." There was something in the way Elias spoke those words, a weight of experience that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. This was not a man making empty boasts or relying on size alone to intimidate. This was someone who had been in similar confrontations before and knew exactly how they concluded. Amos must have sensed it too, because his hand tightened on his gun grip. "Draw, or I'll shoot you down like the dog you are." The crowd gasped collectively, understanding that they were about to witness either an arrest or a killing. Margaret felt time slowing, each heartbeat stretching like taffy as she watched the two men face each other in the dusty schoolyard. Then Elias moved. Margaret had never seen anything like it. One moment he was standing perfectly still. The next he was closing the distance between himself and Amos with impossible speed. The sheriff's gun was halfway out of its holster when Elias's massive fist connected with his jaw, the impact producing a sound like an axe hitting oak. Amos spun completely around from the force of the blow, his hat flying off as he crashed into the schoolhouse steps. His gun discharged harmlessly into the dirt as he fell, the report echoing off the surrounding buildings. For a moment, he lay motionless in the dust, his badge askew and blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at her husband's unconscious form, trying to process what she had just witnessed. In 15 years of marriage, she had never seen Amos lose a physical confrontation. He was strong, fast, and utterly ruthless when challenged. Yet Elias had dropped him with a single punch, moving with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Elias straightened slowly, flexing his right hand as he looked down at the fallen sheriff. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had hoped to avoid this outcome, but knew it was inevitable. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, turning to Margaret with the same gentle courtesy he had always shown her, "are you hurt?" Margaret touched her still-burning cheek, acutely aware that everyone in the crowd was staring at her. "I know. I'm fine. Thank you." Timothy Fletcher had stopped crying entirely, his young face reflecting awe at seeing the terrifying Sheriff Briggs laid low by the quiet man, who sometimes helped his mother carry groceries. Around the schoolyard, other faces showed varying mixtures of shock, fear, and something that might have been relief. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked down at Amos, who was beginning to stir with low groans. "Now we have a problem. When he wakes up, he's going to come after both of us with everything he's got. Both of us. You think he's going to forget that you stood up to him in front of half the town? Men like your husband don't forgive that kind of humiliation." There, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. She knew Elias was right. Amos would never forgive being knocked unconscious in public, and he would blame her as much as his attacker for the loss of face. The beating she would receive once they were alone would be unlike anything she had endured before. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces of the watching townspeople. Margaret could see him calculating, weighing options, considering consequences. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Pack light and fast, only what you absolutely need. Meet me behind Henderson's store in 1 hour. You're asking me to run away with you? I'm offering you a chance to stay alive." Amos groaned louder and tried to push himself up on his elbows. Blood had dried on his split lip, and his eyes, when they focused on Elias, held a fury that made Margaret's stomach clench with fear. "You're a dead man," Amos rasped, spitting blood into the dirt. "Dead and buried." Elias looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "Maybe so, but not today." He turned back to Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her decision for her. It wasn't just kindness or even attraction, it was recognition. He saw her the way she had been before fear became her constant companion, the way she still was in her classroom when she could forget about the man waiting at home. 1 hour, she whispered. Elias nodded and walked away, leaving Margaret standing over her husband as he struggled to regain his feet. The crowd began to disperse, people hurrying away with the quick, nervous movements of those who had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Tom Henderson helped Amos to his feet, the old storekeeper's face carefully neutral as the sheriff swayed and tested his jaw. Margaret watched her husband's eyes clear and focus, saw the moment when full awareness returned, and with it, the promise of retribution that would follow. "Margaret," Amos said, his voice thick with blood and rage, "go home, now." For the first time in 15 years, she looked directly into his eyes and said, "No." Then she turned and walked toward the schoolhouse to gather the few things that mattered most to her, leaving her husband standing in the dust where a gentle giant had knocked him down for daring to strike a lady who deserved better. The revolution had begun with a single word, and Margaret Hale was finally ready to face whatever came next. Margaret's hands trembled as she folded her few precious possessions into a worn carpet bag. Her mother's Bible, the silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, 3 letters from her sister in Denver, and a small daguerreotype of her parents. These were the only things that truly mattered from 23 years of life in Sunrise Creek. Everything else belonged to the woman she had been, the frightened wife who had learned to make herself small and silent. Through her bedroom window, she could see Amos standing in the street, surrounded by his deputies and several of the men who served as his informal enforcers. Even from this distance, she could read the fury in his posture, the way he gestured sharply while issuing orders. The sight made her stomach clench with familiar fear, but underneath the terror was something new, a desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, She could actually escape. The faded wanted poster tucked behind her bedroom mirror caught her eye as she turned to leave. She had found it months ago, blown against their fence by the wind, and something about the young man's face in the crude sketch had seemed familiar. Now, as she looked at it more carefully, her blood ran cold. The features were younger, the hair different, but those eyes she had seen, those exact eyes looking down at her with gentle concern just an hour ago. The Montana ghost read the text beneath the drawing. Wanted for murder in 3 territories, armed and extremely dangerous, 500 reward. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled the poster free from the mirror's frame. The date was 7 years old, but wanted posters had a way of lingering in remote territories where law enforcement was sporadic at best. If this was truly Alias, and the resemblance was too strong to ignore, then she was about to flee into the wilderness with a known killer. Yet even as fear coursed through her veins, Margaret found herself remembering the gentleness in his voice, the careful way he had lifted little Sarah Morrison, the respectful nod he offered her each evening. Could the same hands that had knocked Amos unconscious with such precision really belong to a cold-blooded murderer? A heavy knock on the front door made her heart jump. Through the thin walls, she heard Amos's voice, slurred slightly from his swollen jaw, but still carrying absolute authority. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to search your property for a dangerous fugitive. You'll cooperate, or I'll have you arrested for harboring a criminal." Margaret realized with growing alarm that Amos was going door to door, systematically searching every building in town. He wouldn't come home first. His pride would demand that he capture Elias before dealing with his wife's disobedience. But he would find her eventually, and when he did, her punishment would be beyond anything she had endured before. She stuffed the wanted poster into her bag alongside her other possessions and crept through the house toward the back door. The kitchen still smelled of the morning's biscuits, a homey scent that reminded her of the life she was abandoning. For a moment, doubt overwhelmed her. She was 51 years old, with no family nearby and no resources beyond the few dollars hidden in her sewing box. What kind of future could she possibly build with a wanted killer, assuming they even survived long enough to reach safety? But then she heard Amos shouting at someone in the distance, his voice carrying the particular edge it took on when his authority was questioned. And she remembered the sound of his fist connecting with her ribs just last week. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, they couldn't be worse than the certainties she was leaving behind. The back alley behind Henderson's store was empty when Margaret arrived, clutching her carpet bag and trying to look casual despite the terror coursing through her veins. Shadows were lengthening as the sun moved toward the western mountains, and she realized that nightfall would provide cover for their escape if Elias actually appeared. "Mrs. Briggs." She spun around to find him emerging from behind a stack of supply crates, moving with that same careful silence she had noticed in the schoolyard. Up close, she could see that he had changed from his work clothes into darker garments more suitable for travel, and a bedroll was slung across his broad shoulders. Most significantly, she noticed the gun belt around his waist, not the crude iron most cowboys carried, but a well-maintained Colt .45 in a holster that showed signs of frequent use. "You came," he said, and she heard genuine surprise in his voice. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might have second thoughts. Running away with a stranger isn't something most folks would consider lightly." Margaret looked into his face, searching for any sign of the dangerous man described on the wanted poster. All she saw was the same gentle concern that had drawn her attention over the past months, tempered now with a wariness that suggested he understood exactly how precarious their situation had become. "Are you who I think you are?" she asked quietly. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but a kind of resigned acceptance. "Depends on who you think I am." Margaret pulled the wanted poster from her bag and held it up between them. Elias glanced at it briefly, then met her eyes with unflinching honesty. "That's an old picture. I was a different man then. Are you a killer?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Margaret found herself holding her breath, realizing that his answer would determine not just whether she fled with him, but whether she could trust her own judgment about human nature. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. She had expected denials, explanations, justifications, anything but the quiet acceptance she heard in his voice. Yet something in his manner kept her from stepping back, from abandoning this desperate gamble for freedom. "But not anymore," he continued. "Haven't been for 7 years. Been trying to find a different way to live. Why should I believe you? Because if I was still that man, your husband would be dead instead of just humiliated. And because a killer wouldn't have spent 3 months helping old ladies with their groceries and listening to children's stories." Margaret found herself studying his face, looking for deception and finding only weary truth. This was a man who had done terrible things and was trying to atone for them, not so different, perhaps, from her own attempts to preserve some core of goodness, despite the compromises marriage had forced upon her. "Where will we go?" she asked. "North, toward Canada. I know places we can hide until things settle down." "And if they don't settle down?" Elias was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the alley for any sign of pursuit. "Then we keep running until we find somewhere that will have us." It wasn't much of a plan, Margaret realized. They were about to flee into the Montana wilderness, with winter approaching, pursued by a man who knew the territory and had unlimited resources for a manhunt. Their chances of survival, let alone escape, seemed desperately slim. But as the sound of Amos's voice carried through the evening air, still barking orders to his search parties, Margaret made her choice. She had lived in fear for 15 years, diminishing herself day by day, until she barely remembered who she had been before marriage. Whatever lay ahead with this gentle killer, it had to be better than slowly dying in the cage she had accepted as her life. "Lead the way," she said. Elias nodded and shouldered his pack. As they slipped into the gathering dusk, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The terrifying, exhilarating sensation of stepping into an unknown future where anything might be possible. The abandoned cabin sat in a grove of aspen trees 3 miles north of Sunrise Creek, its roof partially collapsed and walls weathered gray by Montana winters. Elias had led them there through a maze of game trails and creek beds, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew the country intimately. Margaret's legs ached from the unaccustomed hiking, and her practical teaching shoes had proven woefully inadequate for wilderness travel, but she had kept pace without complaint. Inside the cabin, Elias quickly assessed their temporary shelter with a soldier's eye for defensible positions and escape routes. The single room contained the remains of a stone fireplace, a few pieces of broken furniture, and holes in the roof that would provide uncomfortable reminders of the approaching winter. It wasn't much, but the thick walls would hide any light from a small fire, and the surrounding trees would muffle voices. "We can't stay here long," Elias said, setting down his pack and immediately beginning to arrange their meager supplies. "Come morning, your husband's going to start expanding his search pattern." Margaret sank onto a fallen log that had been dragged inside years ago, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. The events of the day seemed unreal, like something from one of the adventure novels she sometimes read to her older students. Just this morning, she had been preparing arithmetic lessons and worrying about Timothy Fletcher's empty stomach. Now she was a fugitive, hiding in ruins with a man whose gentle manner concealed a history of violence. "How do you know so much about search patterns?" she asked, watching as Elias expertly built a small fire using materials that would produce minimal smoke. "Experience," he said simply, but something in his tone discouraged further questions. As flames began to flicker in the old fireplace, Margaret found herself studying her unlikely companion in the dancing light. Away from the civilized confines of Sunrise Creek, Elias seemed different, more alert, more dangerous. His movements had the fluid economy of a predator, and she noticed how his hand never strayed far from the concealed Colt .45 beneath his coat. This was the man from the wanted poster, she realized, the killer who had earned his deadly reputation in these same mountains. Yet when he turned to offer her a share of the jerky and hardtack from his pack, his expression held the same gentle concern she had come to expect. It was as if two different men inhabited the same body, the careful ranch hand who helped with groceries, and the dangerous fugitive who could navigate wilderness and violence with equal skill. "Tell me about Sheriff Briggs," Elias said as they shared their simple meal. "What kind of man is he really?" Margaret considered the question carefully. After 15 years of marriage, she knew Amos's nature better than anyone, understanding the depths of his cruelty and the breadth of his ambitions. "He's not just mean," she said finally. "He's smart, calculating. He never does anything without thinking through all the angles first. That's why you're afraid of him." It wasn't a question, and Margaret nodded. Amos doesn't just want to win, he wants to destroy anyone who crosses him. Complete destruction, so they can never threaten him again. Elias poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the broken roof. Men like that usually have weaknesses, something they care about more than revenge. "His reputation," Margaret said without hesitation. "Amos built his entire identity around being the man who keeps order in lawless territory. Being knocked down in front of half the town that cuts deeper than any physical wound. Which means he won't stop until he's proven his authority again. By killing you and dragging me back in chains," Margaret agreed grimly, "publicly, so everyone understands what happens to people who challenge Sheriff Briggs." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind whisper through the broken cabin walls. Margaret found herself remembering her classroom, wondering if her students would understand why their teacher had simply disappeared. Would anyone tell them the truth? Or would Amos craft some story that painted her as a faithless wife who abandoned her duties? "I never thanked you," she said suddenly, "for what you did today." Elias looked up from the fire, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "For getting you into this mess, for treating me like I mattered, like I was worth defending." The words came out more raw than she had intended, revealing depths of pain and gratitude that surprised them both. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by the emotion in her voice, but Elias simply nodded, as if he understood exactly what those 15 years had cost her. "Any decent man would have done the same," he said quietly. "No," Margaret replied with conviction born of long experience. "Most men would have looked the other way, just like they always have. You're different." Something shifted in Elias's expression, a shadow of old pain that made Margaret wonder what experiences had shaped his unusual code of honor. She was beginning to understand that there were layers to this man's story, depths that might take years to fully explore. "We should get some rest," Elias said, standing and checking the positions of his weapons with automatic precision. "I'll take first watch. Dawn comes early, and we need to be moving before your husband's search parties spread this far." Margaret arranged her shawl as a makeshift pillow and tried to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. Despite her exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible. Every sound from the forest made her heart race, expecting at any moment to hear the thunder of hoofbeats and Amos's voice calling for their surrender. "Elias," she said into the darkness, "the man you used to be, the one on that poster, what changed you?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. "I met someone who showed me there was another way to live, someone who believed I could be better than what I had been. What happened to them? They died because of what I was, because the kind of life I'd been living doesn't leave room for good people." Margaret heard the pain in his voice and understood that this was a wound that still bled years later. Whatever had driven Elias to abandon his violent past, it had cost him dearly. "Maybe," she said carefully, "you've been given a second chance to protect someone who believes in that better man." Elias was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he had fallen asleep. When he finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe, But I won't let my past destroy another innocent person. If staying with me puts you in more danger than you can survive, I'll make sure you reach safety somewhere else." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, oddly comforted by his words, despite their somber implications. This man had killed people, that was an unavoidable truth. But he had also spent 3 months proving that he could choose gentleness over violence, protection over destruction. In a world where her own husband had chosen cruelty at every opportunity, that kind of deliberate goodness seemed almost miraculous. Outside their fragile shelter, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, full of dangers both natural and human. But for the first time in 15 years, Margaret fell asleep feeling safe. Dawn came cold and grey, filtering through the broken roof in pale shafts that revealed their breath misting in the mountain air. Margaret woke to find Elias already moving about their makeshift camp with quiet efficiency, packing their few belongings and preparing for another day of flight. His face bore the haggard look of a man who had spent the night listening for pursuit, and she realized he had probably gotten little sleep. "Time to go," he said softly, handing her a piece of hardtack and some water from his canteen. "I heard riders about an hour ago, still south of here but moving in our direction." Margaret's stomach clenched with familiar fear as she forced herself to eat the tasteless food. The reality of their situation was settling in with the morning light. They were being hunted by men who knew this country, men with fresh horses and unlimited determination. She and Elias were on foot, carrying everything they owned, leaving tracks that any competent tracker could follow. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Elias paused to examine something tucked behind a loose board in the wall. Margaret watched him pull out a small, tattered photograph, the edges worn from handling. Even in the dim light, she could make out 2 figures, a younger Elias standing beside another man of similar build, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested they faced the camera, knowing it might be the last picture ever taken of them. "Your partner?" Margaret asked gently. Elias nodded, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph with unconscious tenderness. "Jake Cartwright. We rode together for 3 years, covering each other's backs from Colorado to Canada." "What happened to him?" "Same thing that happens to most men in our line of work. We took a job that went bad, and he paid the price for my mistakes." Margaret saw the guilt in his eyes and recognized the particular weight of responsibility that came from surviving when others didn't. She had felt something similar after each beating from Amos, wondering what she might have done differently to prevent his anger, how she might have been smarter, or more careful, or simply better. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the people we love pay the price for choices that weren't really ours to make." Elias looked at her sharply, and she saw understanding flicker in his expression. He tucked the photograph back into its hiding place, but not before Margaret caught another detail. Jake Cartwright's face bore a strong resemblance to someone she had seen before, though she couldn't immediately place where. They left the cabin and began climbing higher into the mountains, following game trails that wound between stands of pine and aspen. Elias moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths before, occasionally pausing to listen for sounds of pursuit or to study the ground for signs of other travelers. It was during one of these pauses that they encountered their first real danger. "Down!" Elias whispered urgently, pushing Margaret behind a fallen log as the sound of approaching horses echoed through the trees. 3 riders emerged from a dense grove of pines, moving slowly and studying the ground with the focused attention of experienced trackers. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Jake Morrison, one of Amos's most trusted deputies, a man known for his persistence and ruthless efficiency. The other 2 were unfamiliar, hard-faced men with the look of professional bounty hunters rather than local lawmen. "Sheriff's offering $1,000 for the big man," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Dead or alive, but he'd prefer alive so he can make an example." "What about the woman?" asked one of the bounty hunters, a lean man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed mustache. "Bring her back breathing. Sheriff's got special plans for his wife. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach at those words, knowing exactly what kind of special plans Amos would have for a wife who had defied him so publicly. The beating would be just the beginning. He would want to break her spirit completely, to ensure that she never again found the courage to resist his authority. Beside her, she felt Elias tense as the riders drew closer to their hiding place. His hand moved slowly toward his concealed weapon, and Margaret realized with growing alarm that he was preparing to fight 3 armed men to protect her. The gentle ranch hand was disappearing, replaced by the dangerous killer from the wanted poster. 20 yards, Morrison said, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. They came through here, probably last night. Can't be more than a few hours ahead. The bounty hunter with the mustache spat tobacco juice and adjusted his rifle. Mountains full of hiding places could take days to flush them out. Sheriff don't care how long it takes, Morrison replied. He's bringing up more men from Helena, along with tracking dogs. Sooner or later, we'll corner them. Margaret watched in fascination as something subtle but significant shifted in Elias's bearing. The careful restraint that had characterized his movements since leaving Sunrise Creek was giving way to something more primal, more focused. When he looked at her, his eyes held a deadly calm that made her breath catch in her throat. This was the Montana Ghost, she realized. This was the man who had killed enough people to earn a $500 bounty and a reputation that extended across 3 territories. The transformation was so complete that for a moment she barely recognized the gentle soul who had helped elderly ladies with their groceries. Yet when he reached out to touch her hand, his fingers were as gentle as ever. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "No matter what happens, don't move until I tell you." The 3 riders were now close enough that Margaret could hear their horses breathing, could see the details of their weapons and equipment. Morrison had drawn his rifle and was scanning the surrounding trees with professional caution, while the bounty hunters flanked him with the coordinated movements of men who had worked together before. Something spooked the horses, the second bounty hunter observed, his mount dancing nervously beneath him. Elias rose from behind the log like a force of nature, moving with terrifying speed and precision. His Colt .45 appeared in his hand as if by magic, and Margaret heard 3 distinct gunshots fired so rapidly they almost sounded like a single extended report. Morrison's rifle tumbled from nerveless fingers as he toppled from his saddle, clutching a shattered shoulder. The first bounty hunter managed to clear leather before Elias's second shot spun him around and sent him crashing into the underbrush. The third man, showing more wisdom than courage, threw his hands up in immediate surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice high with fear. "I'm done." Elias kept his gun trained on the survivor while quickly checking the other 2 men. Morrison was unconscious, but breathing, his shoulder bleeding freely but not fatally. The first bounty hunter would need medical attention, but would live to see another day. "You're going to take these men back to town," Elias told the surviving hunter, his voice carrying the same deadly calm Margaret had heard in his eyes. "You're going to tell Sheriff Briggs that the Montana Ghost is back and that he's protecting something worth dying for. Tell him that if he wants to find us, he'd better bring more men." The bounty hunter nodded frantically, already calculating how quickly he could reach safety. As Elias helped load the wounded men onto their horses, Margaret found herself studying this new version of her protector with a mixture of awe and terror. He had disabled 3 armed men in seconds, showing mercy where he could have chosen killing, demonstrating the kind of lethal skill that legends were built upon. Yet when he turned back to her, she saw the same gentle concern that had first drawn her attention, as if the violence had been simply another tool used with precision and care. "Are you all right?" he asked, holstering his weapon with practiced ease. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. She was beginning to understand that the man she had chosen to trust was far more dangerous than she had imagined, and that their pursuers had no idea what they were really hunting. That evening, they took shelter in a shallow cave overlooking a mountain valley, the entrance hidden behind a curtain of pine boughs that Elias arranged with the skill of someone who had evaded pursuit many times before. Margaret sat at the back of the cave, writing in her small leather journal by the light of a carefully shielded candle, while Elias kept watch at the entrance. The journal had been a gift from her sister years ago, intended for recording daily thoughts and experiences. Instead, it had become a repository for all the feelings Margaret couldn't safely express in her marriage. Her dreams of escape, her memories of the woman she had been before, fear became her constant companion, her observations about the students who brought joy to her constrained life. Now she found herself writing about Elias, trying to capture the complexity of a man who could show such devastating violence one moment and such tender concern the next. The transformation she had witnessed during the gunfight haunted her thoughts, not because it frightened her, but because it revealed depths to his character that she was only beginning to understand. "You're writing about what happened today," Elias observed without turning from his watch position. "How did you know? The way you're holding the pen, like you're trying to work out a difficult problem." Margaret smiled despite their circumstances. Even when focused on potential threats, he noticed details about her behavior that Amos had never bothered to observe in 15 years of marriage. "I'm trying to understand who you really are," she admitted. "The man who helped Mrs. Patterson with her groceries, or the one who faced down 3 armed men without breaking a sweat." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his silhouette motionless against the cave entrance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years, spent grappling with the same question. "Both. Neither. I've been trying to figure that out myself for 7 years now." Margaret set down her pen and moved closer to where he sat, drawn by the pain she heard beneath his careful control. "Tell me about Jake Cartwright. Tell me what really happened." She saw his shoulders tense at the mention of his former partner's name, but after a moment he began to speak in the measured tones of someone sharing a story that still caused him pain. "We were hired to eliminate a corrupt sheriff in Wyoming Territory man named Samuel Fletcher, who was taking bribes from cattle rustlers and covering up their raids on homesteaders. Seemed like justice work, getting rid of someone who was supposed to protect people but was helping their enemies instead." Margaret felt a chill at the familiar ring of that name, but said nothing, allowing Elias to continue his confession. "The job went wrong from the start. Fletcher had been expecting trouble, had hired his own gunmen for protection. What should have been a clean elimination turned into a running gunfight through half of Cheyenne. Jake took a bullet in the lung trying to cover my escape. He died protecting you. He died because I was too proud to walk away from a job that had gone bad, too stubborn to admit we were outgunned and outmaneuvered." Elias turned to face her, and in the flickering candlelight Margaret could see the guilt that had driven him to abandon his violent profession. This was a man who had learned the true cost of his choices, who carried the weight of his partner's death like a physical burden. "After Jake died, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pull the trigger knowing that every job might end with someone else paying the price for my decisions. So I started drifting, taking honest work where I could find it, trying to figure out how to live without blood on my hands. That's why you came to Sunrise Creek. That's why I've been running for 7 years, moving from town to town whenever someone recognized me or when the old reputation caught up. I thought maybe Montana would be far enough away, isolated enough, that I could finally stop running." Margaret reached out to touch his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his transformation from killer to ranch hand. "What changed your mind about staying?" "You did." The words hung between them in the flickering light, heavy with implications that neither of them had been ready to acknowledge until now. Margaret felt her heart racing as she realized that this man, this dangerous, gentle, complicated man, had risked everything he had built for himself to protect her from a single moment of violence. "Elias, I know what you're going to say, that I barely know you, that you barely know me, that we're both running from things that can't be outrun forever." "Actually," Margaret said softly, I was going to say that I've spent 15 years married to a man who never once put my welfare ahead of his own convenience. The fact that you would throw away your chance at peace to keep me safe, that means more than you know. Something shifted in Elias's expression, a vulnerability that made him look younger despite the grey threading through his dark hair. Margaret, you need to understand what you're getting into. The Montana Ghost has enemies across 3 territories, men who would kill you just to get to me. If we stay together, you'll never be truly safe. And if we separate, how long before Amos tracks me down? How long before I'm back in that house, paying the price for daring to leave? Margaret pulled her journal closer, opening it to a page she had written weeks ago, before any of this had begun. Listen to this. I sometimes wonder if I have become so small and quiet that I have simply stopped existing, like a candle flame that gutters out without anyone noticing. That was my life, Elias. That was who I was becoming. She closed the journal and met his eyes directly. Today, when you faced those men, when you protected me without hesitation or calculation for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I existed, like I mattered enough to defend. You do matter, Elias said fiercely. You matter more than... He stopped himself, but Margaret heard the words he hadn't spoken, understood the depth of feeling that he was struggling to contain. They were both damaged people, scarred by choices and circumstances that had shaped them in ways they were still learning to understand. But perhaps that very damage made them uniquely suited to heal each other. There's something else, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. That name you mentioned, Samuel Fletcher. I knew a Timothy Fletcher back in Sunrise Creek, one of my students. His father died in a mining accident, but his mother sometimes talked about relatives in Wyoming. Elias went very still. What are you saying? I think the corrupt sheriff you killed might have been that boy's uncle. Which means when Amos interrogated Timothy's family about us, they might have told him more than just which direction we went. The implications hit them both simultaneously. If Amos had discovered the connection between Elias's past and one of Margaret's students, he would know not just who he was hunting, but exactly what buttons to push to force a confrontation. The sheriff wasn't just pursuing a wife and her protector, he was hunting the Montana Ghost. And he had just gained a significant advantage in a game where the stakes were life and death. Outside their cave, the wind carried the distant sound of dogs barking, and Margaret realized that their brief respite was about to end. The barking grew closer, accompanied by the sound of horses and men calling to each other through the darkness. Margaret watched Elias extinguish their candle and begin preparing for another flight, his movements efficient despite the cramped confines of the cave. But something about the approaching voices made her pause, straining to listen more carefully. "That's not Amos," she whispered, recognizing the cadence of the shouted orders. "That's Deputy Caldwell leading the search." Elias froze in his preparations. "Your husband isn't with them?" "I don't think so. Caldwell only takes command when Amos is occupied elsewhere." A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled over Margaret as she considered the implications. Amos never delegated important tasks, especially not something as personal as hunting down his wife and her protector. If he wasn't leading the search himself, it meant he was engaged in something he considered even more critical. "We need to know what he's doing," Margaret said, surprised by the urgency in her own voice. "Margaret, we can't." "Yes, we can. There's an old mining camp about 2 miles east of here, abandoned, but with telegraph lines that still connect to town. If we can reach it, we might be able to find out what Amos is planning." Elias studied her face in the dim starlight filtering through the cave entrance. "You're talking about going back toward danger instead of away from it. I'm talking about understanding what we're really running from." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Elias nodded grimly and shouldered his pack. They slipped out of the cave and began making their way through the forest, using the sound of the search party to mask their own movement. Margaret found herself falling into the rhythm of silent travel that Elias had taught her, placing her feet carefully and avoiding branches that might snap or leaves that might rustle. The abandoned mining camp squatted in a narrow valley, like the skeleton of some great beast, its buildings weathered grey and windows long since broken by wind and neglect. The telegraph office was a small shack near what had once been the main shaft, its wires still humming faintly with distant messages. Elias examined the telegraph equipment with the competence of someone who had used such devices before. "I can tap into the line, but we'll only have a few minutes before someone notices the interference." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding as she watched him make the necessary connections. The clicking of the telegraph key seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the abandoned camp, but soon messages began flowing through the improvised receiver. What they learned made Margaret's blood run cold. The first message was from the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. "Deputy Samuel Fletcher killed 7 years ago by notorious gunfighter known as Montana Ghost. Suspect is Elias Boone, currently wanted for murder in 3 territories. Reward increased to $1,000. The second message was from Amos himself, sent to law enforcement offices across Montana Territory. "Montana Ghost killed my brother. Personal vendetta. Require all available assistance to bring killer to justice." Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet as the pieces suddenly fell into place. Samuel Fletcher hadn't been some distant, corrupt sheriff. He had been Amos's younger brother. Deputy Samuel Fletcher, who had worn a silver badge, just like the one Amos carried, who had been taking bribes and covering up crimes until Elias and Jake had been hired to eliminate him. "Your brother," she whispered, looking at Elias with new understanding. "The job that went wrong, you killed Amos's brother." Elias's face had gone pale in the starlight. "That's why he recognized me. That's why he's been tracking me all these years." Margaret pulled out her small leather journal, frantically flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for, a newspaper clipping she had saved months ago about the death of Deputy Samuel Fletcher. She had kept it because the story had troubled her, describing a young lawman cut down in his prime by ruthless killers. Now she read it with different eyes, seeing the lies and half-truths that painted Amos's corrupt brother as a martyred hero. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the clipping. "Deputy Fletcher had been investigating a cattle rustling operation when he was ambushed by 2 notorious gunfighters known to work together across the Western Territories. Sheriff Amos Briggs of Sunrise Creek has sworn to bring his brother's killers to justice, no matter how long it takes. He's been hunting me for 7 years, Elias said slowly, "ever since Jake died and I disappeared. Amos has been tracking every lead, following every rumor, waiting for me to surface somewhere he could reach me." Margaret felt sick as she realized the full scope of her husband's deception. "My marriage, my entire life in Sunrise Creek, it was all part of his plan to draw you out." "What do you mean?" Margaret's hands shook as she turned to another page in her journal, finding notes she had made about Amos's behavior over the past year. "He's been more violent lately, more public about it. The beating he gave me last month happened right in front of Henderson's store, where you were working. And that incident with Timothy Fletcher, he made sure it happened when you were close enough to witness it." The horrible truth was becoming clear. Amos had orchestrated Margaret's public humiliation, knowing that a man like Elias couldn't stand by and watch a woman being brutalized. The sheriff had used his own wife as bait in an elaborate trap designed to flush out his brother's killer. "He knew you'd intervene," Margaret continued, her voice hollow with shock. "He counted on your decency, your inability to watch someone being hurt. Everything that's happened, it's all been part of his plan for revenge." Elias was staring at the silver deputy's badge that Margaret had found tucked in the back of her journal, a memento of Samuel Fletcher that Amos had given her years ago, claiming it had belonged to a heroic lawman who deserved to be remembered. Now it seemed to mock them both, a symbol of the lies that had shaped their lives. "The bastard played us both," Elias said quietly. "Used your suffering to get to me, and used my conscience to put you in danger." Margaret felt a rage building inside her that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For 15 years, she had endured Amos's cruelty, believing herself trapped in a marriage gone wrong. Now she understood that her suffering had been deliberate, calculated, designed to serve her husband's obsession with revenge. "He made me a prisoner in my own life," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "Beat me, terrorized me, destroyed my spirit all so he could use me as bait to catch you." The telegraph continued clicking, bringing more messages that painted an increasingly clear picture of Amos's plans. He had called in favors from law enforcement agencies across 3 territories, assembled a massive manhunt with tracking dogs and experienced bounty hunters, and positioned himself as the grieving brother seeking justice for a fallen lawman. But the most chilling message came last, sent from Amos to his assembled posse. "Montana Ghost will attempt to flee north toward Canada. Block all passes and force him back toward Sunrise Creek. Want him alive, so he can watch his woman pay the price for his crimes before he dies." Margaret and Elias looked at each other in the dim light of the abandoned telegraph office, both understanding that their situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just a manhunt, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge that had been years in the planning. "We can't run anymore," Margaret said firmly. "He'll just keep coming, keep using innocent people as pawns in his game. We have to end this." Elias nodded grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his concealed weapon. "Then we go back to Sunrise Creek. We face him on ground of our choosing, instead of letting him drive us like cattle to slaughter. That's exactly what he wants. Maybe, but it's also the only way to protect the people he might hurt to get to us. Your students, their families, anyone else he might decide to use as leverage." Margaret closed her journal and tucked the deputy's badge into her pocket, a tangible reminder of the lies that had shaped her life. When we face him, he's going to learn that some prices are too high to pay, even for revenge. Outside the telegraph office, the mountain wind carried the distant howling of tracking dogs, but Margaret no longer felt the fear that had driven them for the past 2 days. Instead, she felt something harder and more dangerous, the cold determination of a woman who had finally understood the true nature of her cage and was ready to break free, no matter what it cost. The journey back to Sunrise Creek took them 3 days of careful movement through terrain that Elias knew better than any of their pursuers. Instead of fleeing north toward Canada, as Amos expected, they circled south and west, using abandoned mining trails and forgotten settler paths to approach the town from an unexpected direction. Margaret found herself marveling at the transformation in her companion. The gentle ranch hand had completely given way to the tactical precision of the Montana Ghost, every decision calculated to give them the maximum advantage in the confrontation to come. On their final night in the wilderness, they camped in the ruins of an old trapper's cabin barely 5 miles from town. Elias had spent the day conducting what he called reconnaissance, observing the search parties and noting the deployment of Amos's forces. The sheriff had indeed assembled an impressive manhunt, with tracking teams spread across the northern approaches to town and checkpoint established at every major trail. "He's got maybe 30 men total," Elias reported as they shared cold food by the light of a carefully shielded candle. "Half of them are locals who know the country but aren't professional fighters. The other half are hired guns from Helena and Billings Dangerous, but they don't know the specific terrain around Sunrise Creek." Margaret studied the rough map he had sketched in the dirt, noting the positions and movements he had observed. "What about the townspeople? Will they support Amos or stay neutral?" "Depends on how much truth they're willing to face. Your husband's built his reputation on being the man who keeps order, but he's also built it on fear. If people start questioning his methods, his authority might crumble faster than he expects." Elias pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, checking the time with automatic precision. The timepiece was worn smooth from years of handling, its silver case bearing scratches and dents that spoke of a hard life on the frontier. Margaret had noticed him consulting it frequently over the past few days, as if it provided some kind of anchor in the chaos of their situation. "That was your father's?" she asked gently. Elias nodded, his thumb tracing the familiar engravings on the case. He was a circuit preacher, spent his life trying to bring some measure of civilization to mining camps and cattle towns. Never carried a gun, never raised his voice in anger, but somehow commanded more respect than most men, with badges. What would he think of what you became? Disappointed, but not surprised. He always said that violence was a choice, not a necessity, and that every man had to decide which version of himself he wanted to be. Margaret heard the pain in his voice and understood that this confrontation with Amos represented more than just a fight for survival. It was Elias's chance to finally become the man his father had hoped he could be, to choose protection over destruction, even when the cost might be his own life. And what version of yourself are you choosing now? Elias closed the watch and tucked it back into his vest, his expression resolving into something that reminded Margaret of granite, shaped by wind and weather. The version that doesn't let innocent people pay the price for my past mistakes. The version that stands between monsters and the people they want to hurt. They spent the hours before dawn, making their final preparations, checking weapons and reviewing the plan they had developed during their journey. Margaret would approach the town openly during the morning market, when the streets would be crowded with ordinary citizens going about their daily business. Her public appearance would force Amos to act carefully, unable to simply gun her down without risking the townspeople's support. Elias would position himself in the schoolhouse, the building Margaret knew better than any other in town and the place where their confrontation had begun. If Amos wanted to face the Montana ghost, he would have to come to ground of their choosing, surrounded by reminders of what they were really fighting for. "You don't have to do this," Elias said as they prepared to separate for the final approach to town. "There's still time to run, to find safety somewhere far from all of this." Margaret looked toward Sunrise Creek, thinking of her students and the life she had built despite Amos's efforts to destroy her spirit. Those children deserve better than to grow up in a town ruled by a man who would use anyone as a pawn in his personal vendettas. And I deserve better than to spend the rest of my life running from the truth about what I endured. She pulled out her journal and quickly wrote 3 letters, one to her sister in Denver, one to the Territorial Education Office, recommending her replacement, and one to Timothy Fletcher's mother, explaining the truth about what had happened to his uncle. Whatever the outcome of the confrontation to come, she wanted to ensure that certain truths would survive. "If something happens to me," she said, handing the letters to Elias, "make sure these reach the right people." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Elias replied with fierce certainty. "I won't let it." Margaret stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, tasting the salt of honest sweat and the mountain air that clung to his skin. "You've already given me more than you know. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like myself again, like the woman I was meant to be, instead of the frightened creature I became." They held each other for a moment in the pre-dawn darkness, 2 damaged people who had found in each other the strength to face whatever came next. Then they separated, each moving toward their appointed position in a drama that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone in Sunrise Creek. Margaret approached the town as the sun crested the eastern mountains, walking down Main Street with the same measured pace she had used for 23 years of teaching. People stopped and stared as they recognized her, whispers following in her wake as word spread that the sheriff's missing wife had returned. She nodded politely to familiar faces and ignored the fearful glances, projecting a calm confidence that she didn't entirely feel. Mrs. Patterson dropped her market basket when Margaret passed, vegetables scattering across the wooden sidewalk. "Margaret, child, what are you doing here? The sheriff's been tearing the territory apart looking for you." "I know," Margaret replied calmly. "That's why I came back. It's time this ended." She continued toward the schoolhouse, feeling the weight of watching eyes and knowing that every step took her closer to a confrontation that had been building for 7 years. Behind her, she could hear people calling to each other, spreading word of her return with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Inside the schoolhouse, Elias was waiting exactly where they had planned, positioned near the blackboard where Margaret had written thousands of lessons for children who trusted her to prepare them for adult responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were about to face the most important test of their lives in a room dedicated to education and growth. "He knows you're here," Elias said without turning from his watch position at the window. "I saw Deputy Caldwell running toward the jail the moment you appeared on Main Street." Margaret set her journal on her teaching desk and took her position near the slate board that had been her sanctuary for so many years. "How long do we have?" "Not long. Amos will want to control the situation, but he'll also want witnesses to see him restore his authority. My guess is he'll come with enough men to ensure victory, but not so many that it looks like he was afraid of facing us." Outside, they could hear the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, voices calling orders, and the jingle of spurs as armed men took positions around the schoolhouse. Margaret felt her heart racing but forced herself to breathe steadily, drawing on the same calm she had cultivated during 15 years of survival. "Margaret," Elias said quietly, still watching the street, "I want you to know that these past few days, with you, they've been the best of my life. Whatever happens next, you helped me remember who I wanted to be. And you helped me discover who I actually am," she replied. "Not the victim Amos tried to create, but the woman who was strong enough to survive him and brave enough to stand against him." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and through the window, Margaret could see armed figures taking positions across the street. Amos would be here soon, ready to complete the revenge he had spent 7 years planning. But he would find that his carefully laid trap had caught more than just the Montana ghost. It had awakened a teacher who was ready to give her students one final lesson about courage, justice, and the price of standing up to bullies. Margaret touched the silver deputy's badge in her pocket, thinking of all the lies it represented, and prepared to face the man who had stolen 15 years of her life in service of his obsession with the past. The schoolhouse bell had not rung since Margaret's disappearance 3 days ago, its bronze surface dulled by the morning frost that clung to everything in the mountain air. Now, as armed men took positions around the building where she had spent the best years of her life, Margaret reached up and grasped the rope with steady hands. The clear, resonant tone that had called children to learning for 23 years now served a different purpose, echoing across Sunrise Creek like a challenge thrown down to the man who had made her life a prison. 1 ring, then 2, then 3, the same pattern she had used every morning to gather her students, now gathering the entire town to witness the final confrontation between Sheriff Amos Briggs and the ghosts of his own making. Through the schoolhouse windows, Margaret could see people emerging from their homes and businesses, drawn by the familiar sound that had been absent for days. Tom Henderson stepped out of his store, shading his eyes against the morning sun. Mrs. Patterson appeared on her front porch, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. Even young Timothy Fletcher could be seen at the edge of the crowd, his mother's protective hand on his shoulder. "Good," Elias said quietly from his position near the door. "The more witnesses, the harder it will be for Amos to control the narrative afterward." Margaret let the bell rope swing free and turned to face the room where she had shaped young minds and found purpose, despite the darkness in her personal life. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the slate board where she had written her final lesson 3 days ago, arithmetic problems that seemed impossibly distant now, relics of a simpler time when her greatest concern was helping children understand fractions. "There," Elias said, pointing toward the main street. "He's coming." Margaret moved to the window and felt her breath catch at the sight of her husband, leading a small army down Main Street. Amos walked with the measured pace of a man absolutely certain of his authority, his sheriff's badge catching the sunlight like a mirror. Behind him came 6 deputies and hired guns, their weapons drawn but held low, their formation designed to intimidate rather than immediately threaten. But it was Amos himself who commanded attention. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the cold fury that had driven him for 7 years. the obsessive need for revenge that had shaped every decision he made. His jaw was still swollen from Elias's punch, and she noticed how he favored his left side slightly, evidence that the humiliation he had suffered was both physical and psychological. The crowd that had gathered in response to the bell began to part as the armed men approached, but Margaret was gratified to see that many people remained, pressing against building walls and peering around corners to witness whatever was about to unfold. These were her neighbors, people who had trusted her with their children's education, and their presence gave her strength. "Mrs. Briggs," Amos called out when the group stopped in front of the schoolhouse, his voice carrying the formal authority he used when addressing criminals. "You will come out immediately and submit to lawful custody." Margaret stepped into the doorway where she could be clearly seen, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. For 15 years, these same people had watched her endure Amos's casual cruelties, had turned away when she appeared with bruises, had chosen the comfortable fiction that what happened between husband and wife was none of their concern. "Sheriff Briggs," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the street, "I am exactly where I belong. This is my schoolhouse, and these are my people." A murmur ran through the watching crowd at her words, and Margaret saw several faces that reflected surprise at her defiant tone. This was not the quiet, frightened woman they had known, the one who spoke softly and kept her eyes down when her husband was present. "You are my wife," Amos snarled, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "You belong where I say you belong." "I was your victim," Margaret corrected, stepping fully outside the schoolhouse so that everyone could see her clearly. "But I am not your property, and I never was." Behind Amos, she could see his men shifting uncomfortably as the confrontation took on a tone they hadn't expected. This was supposed to be a simple arrest of a runaway wife and her accomplice, but Margaret's public defiance was turning it into something more complex and potentially damaging to their leader's reputation. "Where is he?" Amos demanded, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. "Where is the killer you ran away with?" "You mean Elias Boone?" Margaret asked innocently. "The man who defended me when you struck me in front of half the town. The man who showed me more kindness in 3 days than you showed me in 15 years of marriage." The crowd stirred at her words, and Margaret heard whispered conversations beginning among the watchers. She was deliberately forcing Amos to acknowledge his actions in public, making it impossible for him to maintain the fiction that he was simply a lawman pursuing criminals. "That man," Amos said through gritted teeth, "is a notorious killer known as the Montana Ghost. He murdered my brother in cold blood and has been hiding among you like a snake in your midst." "Your brother," Margaret said, her voice ringing with newfound authority, "was Samuel Fletcher, the corrupt deputy who was taking bribes from cattle rustlers and covering up their crimes. The territorial marshal's files are quite clear about that." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow, and Margaret heard gasps of surprise from people who were learning for the first time that their sheriff's obsession with revenge was based on protecting a criminal. Amos's face flushed red above his beard, and she could see him struggling to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "Enough!" he snarled, drawing his gun and pointing it directly at Margaret's heart. "You will surrender now, or I will arrest you for conspiracy and harboring a fugitive." It was exactly the moment Margaret had been waiting for, the instant when Amos revealed his true nature to everyone, watching, showing them the man behind the badge who would threaten to shoot an unarmed woman rather than face the truth about his own corruption. "Go ahead," she said calmly, standing perfectly still in the schoolhouse doorway. "Shoot an unarmed schoolteacher in front of her students and their parents. Show everyone exactly what kind of man you really are." The moment stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Amos's gun trained on Margaret's heart, while the entire town held its breath. Then Elias stepped out of the schoolhouse behind her, his presence transforming the confrontation from a sheriff threatening his wife into something far more dangerous. "Sheriff Briggs," Elias said calmly, his hands visible but ready, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Amos's eyes blazed with 7 years of accumulated fury as he looked upon the man who had killed his brother. "Montana Ghost, I've been waiting a long time for this. Not as long as I've been waiting to face the consequences of my past." Margaret felt the tension crackling between the two men like electricity before a thunderstorm, but she noticed something that gave her hope. Several of Amos's hired guns were looking uncertain, glancing at each other and at the watching crowd with expressions that suggested they were having second thoughts about the situation they had walked into. "You murdered Samuel Fletcher," Amos continued, his voice rising with righteous anger. "Gunned him down like a dog in the streets of Cheyenne." "Your brother was taking money from cattle rustlers," Elias replied evenly, "covering up raids that got innocent homesteaders killed. I was hired to stop him, and I did. He was a lawman. He was a criminal with a badge." The simple statement hit the crowd like a thunderclap, and Margaret saw understanding dawn on faces throughout the gathering. These people had lived under Amos's harsh rule for years, accepting his methods because they believed he was protecting them from worse alternatives. Now they were beginning to question whether the man they had trusted was any better than the criminals he claimed to fight. Tom Henderson stepped forward from the crowd, his aged voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Sheriff, is it true? Was your brother taking bribes?" Amos whirled toward the storekeeper, his gun still drawn, his face flushed with rage at having his authority questioned by a civilian. "How dare you?" "Because if it's true," Henderson continued courageously, "then maybe we should be asking what other things you've done in the name of justice that weren't actually justice at all." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the old man who had given Elias work and shelter, who was now risking his own safety to speak truth in the face of armed authority. Around the street, she could see other faces beginning to show similar resolve. Mrs. Patterson nodding in agreement, several of the local ranchers muttering among themselves, even some of Amos's own deputies looking uncertain about their loyalties. "You want to know the truth?" Amos snarled, his careful composure finally cracking completely. "The truth is that I've kept this town safe for 15 years, while the rest of you were too weak to do what needed doing. The truth is that sometimes justice requires hard choices that soft people can't understand." He pulled his sheriff's badge from his vest and held it up for everyone to see, the silver star that had been the symbol of his authority now trembling in his shaking hand. "This badge gives me the right to make those choices. This badge makes me the law in this territory." "That badge," Margaret said quietly, "doesn't give you the right to beat your wife. It doesn't give you the right to use innocent people as bait for your personal vendettas. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to cover up your brother's crimes." Amos's face contorted with fury, and Margaret saw the exact moment when his last vestige of self-control snapped. The careful lawman facade fell away completely, revealing the brutal, obsessed man who had made her life a nightmare for 15 years. "You sanctimonious bitch," he hissed, swinging his gun toward her. "I should have beaten the defiance out of you years ago." The shot came so suddenly that Margaret barely registered the sound. Amos's gun discharged harmlessly into the dirt as Elias's bullet shattered his wrist, sending the weapon spinning away across the street. The sheriff screamed and clutched his ruined hand, blood streaming between his fingers as he staggered backward. But Elias wasn't finished. Moving with the lethal precision that had made him a legend, he closed the distance between them before any of Amos's men could react. His second shot took down the deputy, who was reaching for his own weapon, while his third sent a hired gun diving for cover behind a water trough. "Anyone else?" Elias called out, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had faced death so many times that it held no fear for him. The remaining men looked at their wounded leader, at the deadly calm of the Montana Ghost, and at the faces of townspeople who were no longer showing fear, but something much more dangerous, judgment. One by one, they began laying down their weapons, understanding that they had walked into a situation that had changed beyond their ability to control. Amos knelt in the dust of Main Street, cradling his shattered wrist and staring up at the man who had finally brought him to account for 15 years of cruelty and corruption. His sheriff's badge lay beside him in the dirt, its authority as broken as the hand that had once pinned it on with such pride. "It's over," Margaret said, looking down at the man who had ruled her life through fear and violence. "Your time is finished." The badge that had terrorized a town for 15 years would never again carry the weight of unquestioned authority, and Margaret felt the last chains of her captivity finally fall away. 6 months after the confrontation that ended Amos Briggs's reign of terror, Margaret stood at the front of her classroom watching spring sunlight stream through windows that had been repaired and cleaned until they sparkled. The same slate board bore the day's lessons, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Her students sat straighter, spoke more freely, and approached their studies with the kind of enthusiasm that could only flourish in an atmosphere free from fear. Timothy Fletcher raised his hand to answer a question about geography, his young face bright with the confidence that had slowly returned as the shadows of his former sheriff's intimidation faded. The boy's mother had written to thank Margaret for revealing the truth about his Uncle Samuel, explaining that knowing the real story, however painful, was better than living with lies that poisoned the family's understanding of their own history. "Very good, Timothy," Margaret said, smiling at the eager student. "Now, who can tell me about the territorial government in Helena?" Sarah Morrison's hand shot up, and Margaret marveled at the transformation in the shy girl who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper when Sheriff Briggs visited the school. The entire community had undergone a similar metamorphosis as people gradually shed the habits of fearful silence that Amos had instilled in them over 15 years of harsh rule. Through the window, Margaret could see Elias working in the garden behind their small house, the muscles in his broad shoulders moving rhythmically as he turned the soil for summer planting. They had married in a simple ceremony 3 months ago, with Tom Henderson serving as witness and most of the town attending in a celebration that felt more like a collective exhale of relief than a traditional wedding. The new wedding ring on Margaret's finger caught the sunlight as she wrote on the blackboard a simple gold band that Elias had crafted himself from metal he had panned from the creek. Its honest simplicity, a stark contrast to the ornate ring Amos had given her that now lay buried somewhere in the mountains where she had thrown it during their flight. This ring represented everything the first one hadn't choice. Instead of coercion, love instead of possession, a partnership built on mutual respect rather than fear and control. When Elias had placed it on her finger, his hands gentle despite their capacity for violence, Margaret had felt herself becoming whole in a way she hadn't experienced since girlhood. The territorial marshal had arrived from Helena 2 days after the confrontation, drawn by reports of the dramatic showdown on Main Street. After interviewing dozens of witnesses and reviewing the evidence of Amos's corruption, he had officially cleared Elias of all charges related to Samuel Fletcher's death, declaring it a justified action against a criminal who had been abusing his authority. Amos himself had been transported to the territorial prison in Deer Lodge, his shattered wrist healed, but his spirit broken by the complete collapse of everything he had built his identity upon. The last Margaret had heard, he spent his days in solitary confinement, ranting about revenge and justice to anyone who would listen. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a profound relief that his capacity to hurt others had finally been ended. The afternoon bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and Margaret watched her students file out with the kind of orderly enthusiasm that spoke well of their characters and futures. Several of them called out cheerful goodbyes to Elias as they passed the garden, and he responded with the gentle warmth that had first drawn Margaret's attention months ago. "Mrs. Boone," young Sarah Morrison said, pausing at Margaret's desk with the kind of serious expression that suggested an important question was coming. "Are you happy now?" The directness of childhood never failed to surprise Margaret with its ability to cut straight to the heart of complex adult emotions. She considered the question carefully, looking out at the life she had built from the ashes of her former existence. "Yes, Sarah," she said simply. "I am happy now." The girl smiled and skipped out to join her friends, leaving Margaret alone in the classroom that had served as her sanctuary during the darkest years and now stood as a testament to the possibility of transformation and renewal. She gathered her materials and prepared to close the school for another day, her movements filled with the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work well done. Outside, Elias was waiting with the patient devotion that characterized all his actions, his face lighting up when he saw her emerge from the building. Despite the months that had passed, Margaret still sometimes felt surprise at being the recipient of such unconditional care, at being valued and protected, not as a possession, but as a partner in building something better than either of them could create alone. "How were the children today?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward their home. "Wonderful, full of questions and possibilities." Timothy asked if he could write to his cousins in Wyoming to tell them the real story about what happened to their father. Elias nodded thoughtfully. Truth has a way of healing things that lies can never fix. They walked in comfortable silence through streets that no longer held the tension of a community living under the thumb of a tyrant. People called out friendly greetings, children played without the nervous watchfulness that had once characterized their behavior, and the general atmosphere reflected a town that had rediscovered its capacity for simple human decency. At their front gate, Margaret paused to look back at the schoolhouse, where she had found her purpose and where she had finally found the courage to claim her freedom. The building stood solid and welcoming in the afternoon light, ready for tomorrow's lessons and the endless cycle of growth and discovery that education represented. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked quietly, "giving up the chance to run away to some place where no one knew our history?" Margaret thought of the woman she had been 6 months ago, frightened, diminished, trapped in a life that slowly strangled her spirit. Then she looked at the man beside her, at the community they had helped heal, at the future they were building together through daily choices to be better than their pasts had demanded. "Never," she said, reaching for his hand as they walked through the gate toward home. "Some things are worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything we thought we wanted, and some love is worth whatever price we have to pay to protect it." The simple gold ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight as they disappeared into the house they had made together. Two people who had found in each other the strength to transform not just their own lives, but an entire community. Behind them, the mountains of Montana Territory stretched endlessly toward tomorrow, full of promise and possibility.